The catalyst for this deep dive into the past was a vast collection of scattered materials that we have finally managed to piece together into a coherent picture. We are talking about the grand phenomenon of industrial exhibitions, which were held with enviable regularity in many countries throughout the 19th and very early 20th centuries. The Russian Empire was no exception. Such events were organized there constantly, demonstrating the highest level of technical and cultural development. However, this process came to an abrupt halt. In Russia, exhibitions were held right up until 1917, after which, for obvious historical reasons, they ceased. But the most surprising fact lies elsewhere, in other states and even on other continents. Under completely different political systems, this tradition was also interrupted almost synchronously, with only a slight delay in time. There are definitely implicit cause and effect links here, pointing to the global nature of these changes. It would seem that with such a scale of events, covering Europe, both Americas, Asia, and Africa, an incredible amount of visual evidence should remain. But when trying to delve deeper into the topic, researchers encounter a paradoxical situation. On domestic resources, photo catalogs of these events are practically non-existent in the public domain, while digitized text reports and dry statistics exist in unimaginable numbers. Foreign archives appear slightly better stocked, and it is there that unique materials occasionally surface, including those regarding Russia of that time, which in itself raises many questions about the preservation of historical memory. To solve this riddle, we must turn to the center of the world's exhibition life of that period: Paris. It was the Universal Expositions in France that set the tone for global development, from art to the military industry, and participation in them was considered mandatory for any country wishing to remain at the vanguard of progress. The main action unfolded in the monumental palace of the Champ de Mars. Today, this building does not exist, which is an extremely strange fact for thrifty Europe, as such structures are usually guarded like the apple of one's eye. If we analyze historical images of the Champ de Mars development from that time, a completely different view of familiar landmarks opens up. The Eiffel Tower, which we are used to seeing as a standalone object, looked different in 1900. Unintelligible, spherical elements were fixed to its load-bearing parts, and the structure was adorned with a massive arched cornice featuring lamps. Upon detailed study, specific pillars can be seen between the arches, surprisingly similar to those that were located on the roof of the now-vanished Palace of the Champ de Mars. This observation leads to an unexpected conclusion. The famous tower was initially conceived not as a lonely monument, but as a temporary structure serving as the entrance arch for the 1889 exhibition. It formed a single architectural and likely engineering ensemble with the palace. By all appearances, these objects were united into a common network. The disappearance of the Palace of the Champ de Mars and the subsequent modification of the Eiffel Tower are closely linked. When the main complex was dismantled, the complex cornice on the tower became functionally useless and was replaced by a simplified decorative structure, and the mysterious elements vanished. However, the most interesting object for research remains the Palace of Machines, another colossal structure that has not survived to this day. It was here that the advanced achievements of world mechanical engineering were concentrated, and it is here, among giant mechanisms and steam boilers, that archival footage reveals details that do not fit into the official version of technical history. Amidst heavy industry and machine tools, for some reason, there were many objects resembling miniature cult structures. Inside these little churches, complex mechanisms are visible, which completely changes the understanding of their purpose. In the background of one of the exhibition complexes, a strange structure resembling a water tower can be noticed, but its execution casts doubt on such primitive use. For a water pump in that climatic zone, this would have been too bold and impractical a solution, which would have ceased to function at the first frost. Most likely, this was a modernized, domed structure that in some way acted upon those very pillars located on the roofs of neighboring buildings. It is possible that this system had a direct connection with the elements on the cornice of the Eiffel Tower, creating a single energy field, the nature of which we have yet to unravel. An inexplicable situation surrounds the documentary heritage of that era. When attempting to reconstruct in detail the events that took place within the Russian Empire, researchers encounter a phenomenon that can be called the archival paradox. A colossal volume of digitized information is available in the public domain. Text reports, statistical summaries, detailed catalogs of participants, and lists of medal winners. These documents are riddled with numbers, names of engineers, company names, and descriptions of pavilions. It would seem the bureaucratic machine worked flawlessly, recording every step. However, when it comes to visual confirmation, photographs, blueprints, schematics, an information vacuum arises. It is practically impossible to find high-quality photo catalogs of industrial exhibitions of that time on domestic resources. One gets the impression that a certain unspoken filter exists. Text, as a carrier of abstract information, was preserved, while images, capable of conveying details of technologies and the real appearance of devices, were subjected to systematic removal. After all, it is the visual aspect that carries information that cannot be faked or interpreted ambiguously in a dry report. Text can be rewritten, numbers adjusted, but a photograph of a complex unit with an operating principle incomprehensible to a modern engineer becomes dangerous evidence. This absence of illustrations against the backdrop of giant text arrays looks not like an accidental loss, but as the result of a deliberate cleanup of history. The situation only begins to clarify when turning to foreign sources. In the archives of other countries, the picture looks different. Far more visual materials have been preserved there, and, paradoxically, it is in foreign catalogs that rare snapshots of Russian expositions surface. An absurd situation arises. To see what the achievements of domestic industry looked like in the late 19th century, one must search for their traces in the Library of Congress in the USA or the National Archives of France. This strange distribution of information suggests that the process of oblivion was controlled not just locally, but had specific geographical features, where some regions were scrubbed more thoroughly than others. To understand the true scale and level of technology of that time, it is necessary to shift focus to where the concentration of engineering thought reached its peak. At the end of the 19th century, such a center was, undoubtedly, Paris. It was the Universal Expositions held in the French capital in 1889 and 1900 that became the apotheosis of the technical development of civilization. These were not just fairs, but a demonstration of the power of a unified global progress, where participating countries, including Russia, competed in the grandeur of their pavilions and the boldness of engineering solutions. Paris set trends that were instantly picked up around the world, from architectural styles to principles of energy supply. The main arena for these events was the Champ-de-Mars. If we study old plans and engravings, it becomes obvious that the organization of the space differed radically from the modern one. The central place was occupied by the majestic palace of the Champ-de-Mars, a monumental structure intended to demonstrate the greatness of human genius. However, today not a trace remains of this palace. For European culture, which usually treats the preservation of its architectural heritage with trepidation, the complete destruction of such a significant object looks extremely suspicious. In the place where the walls of the palace once towered, there is now emptiness or completely different development, having nothing in common with past grandeur. But the disappearance of the palace is only part of the puzzle. The main oddity lies in how this palace interacted with the surrounding space. When analyzing panoramic views of that time, attention is inevitably drawn to the dominant feature of Paris, which became its symbol. However, the silhouette of the famous tower familiar to us has significant differences in old images that cannot be written off as artistic fiction or the quality of photography. The structure we know today looks like a cropped or simplified version of that complex engineering complex that existed at the turn of the century. The question arises, do we really understand the true purpose of this structure, or is its modern appearance merely a frame, stripped of its main functional filling? Upon detailed study of archival evidence concerning the main symbol of Paris, a sense of cognitive dissonance inevitably arises between the modern look of the Eiffel Tower and how it was captured at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. What tourists today perceive as a finished, monumental object, upon closer inspection, turns out to be merely a skeleton, deprived of its most vital, functional organs. Historical documents from 1900 demonstrate a structure possessing a number of details inexplicable from the point of view of traditional architecture. On the load-bearing elements of the tower, fixed spherical objects are clearly visible, the purpose of which is not clarified in official reference books, and the body itself is girdled by a complex arched cornice equipped with electric lamps. Particular attention is drawn to the structure of this vanished cornice. If we analyze its device, it becomes noticeable that specific vertical pillars were installed between the decorative arches. These elements bore no obvious load and did not support the structures above, which rules out a purely constructional purpose. The riddle begins to unravel if we compare these details with the architecture of other buildings of that era, in particular with the now lost palace of the Champ-de-Mars. On the roof of this colossal structure, absolutely identical pillars were located, lined up in strict geometric rows. Such an exact coincidence of forms and sizes on two different objects cannot be an accident or the whim of a decorator architect. This points to the existence of a unified technical standard. The Eiffel Tower was initially designed and erected not as a lonely spire, but as a temporary structure fulfilling the function of an entrance arch for the Universal Exposition of 1889. This status of entrance arch should be understood much more broadly than just a passageway for visitors. The tower formed a single, inseparable ensemble with the Palace of the Champ-de-Mars. Their proximity and the presence of identical pillar finials indicate that they were nodes of one chain, an integrated engineering network. Probably, the tower played the role of a giant antenna, receiver, or transmitter, which interacted with the equipment installed on the roof of the palace. It was a symbiotic system where every element was necessary for the functioning of the whole. It is this interconnection that explains the subsequent metamorphoses that happened to the Iron Lady. As soon as the exhibition ended and the decision was made to dismantle the Palace of the Champ-de-Mars, the single circuit turned out to be broken. The disappearance of one of the key components of the system made the functional equipment on the tower itself useless. The complex arched cornice, with lamps and mysterious resonator pillars, ceased to fulfill its technical task. Subsequently, in the process of so-called reconstruction, these elements were dismantled, and simplified decorations appeared in their place, mimicking the former shapes but devoid of internal content. What we see now is essentially a powered-down device, of which only the casing remains. Surprisingly, even the survival of the tower itself was presented as a happy accident, because as a temporary structure, it was subject to demolition. However, it was saved, having been previously stripped of its technological stuffing. The disappearance of the Palace of the Champ-de-Mars, which was an integral part of this energy complex, looks like the intentional destruction of evidence that allowed one to understand the operating principle of the entire system. After all, if we assume that the pillars on the roof of the palace and on the tower were elements of wireless transmission or generation of energy, then it becomes clear why they were removed so hastily when the need to demonstrate miracles fell away. The connection between the buildings was carried out on principles that today might seem like science fiction, but for the engineers of that time were obviously a working reality. The tower rising above Paris was only the visible part of the iceberg, the tip of a giant machine. But if it served as a transmitter, or perhaps a resonator in this chain, then where was the heart of the system located? Where was the main power node generating that energy which made the lamps glow without the wires and cables familiar to us? The answer to this question leads us to another grand structure of that exhibition, which suffered an even sadder and more mysterious fate. It was wiped off the face of the earth completely, leaving not even a foundation behind. We are speaking of the legendary Palace of Machines. Among the multitude of lost architectural masterpieces that became victims of inexplicable oblivion, a special place is occupied by the legendary Palace of Machines. This cyclopean structure, which was the heart of the Paris exhibitions, represented not just an exhibition pavilion, but a true triumph of engineering thought, where all the advanced achievements of world mechanical engineering of that time were concentrated. However, the fate of this giant turned out to be tragic and mysterious. Despite its uniqueness and the colossal cost of construction, the palace has not survived to our days. For pragmatic and thrifty Europe, such wastefulness, the demolition of a fully functional and majestic building, looks, to say the least, like a strange phenomenon. The fact remains, the space where the pinnacle of human technical progress was demonstrated was cleared to zero, as if someone were trying to hide not only the structure itself, but also the principles embedded in its design. When analyzing surviving images of the exterior of this complex, researchers discovered details that categorically do not fit into the official historical narrative. In the background, in immediate proximity to the main buildings, one can notice a tall structure, which in traditional descriptions is often classified as a water tower or water pump. However, upon careful examination of the engineering features of this object, this version begins to crumble. The structure looks too open work and complex for a utilitarian water reservoir. Moreover, for the climatic conditions of the region, such a solution would be extremely risky. In the winter period, at sub-zero temperatures, an open water supply system of such configuration would inevitably fail, turning into a block of ice. The technical inexpediency of a water tower forces us to seek other explanations for its presence in the center of a technological exhibition. Most likely, we are dealing with a certain modernized domed structure, the shape of which was dictated not by aesthetics, but by physical laws. A dome, crowned with a spire, in the context of alternative energy, is viewed as a concentrator or receiver of vibrations. There is a hypothesis that this object in some way acted upon the vertical pillars located in rows on the roof of the building standing in front. If we consider the architectural ensemble as a single schematic, then the water tower could fulfill the role of a field generator or signal amplifier, which was transmitted to the receiving elements of the roof. This assumption completely changes the view on the architecture of the late 19th century. What we are used to considering decorative excesses, spires, domes, colonnades on roofs, could actually be components of a complex wireless energy system. In this logic, the connection between various objects of the exhibition becomes clear. If the Palace of Machines and neighboring pavilions were saturated with equipment requiring energy, and the power lines familiar to us are not observed in the necessary volume in photographs of that time, it means energy arrived in a different way. The domed structure in the background, interacting with atmospheric electricity or the etheric field, could broadcast potential to the pillar antennas installed on roofs and cornices. When this technology was recognized as dangerous or undesirable for widespread distribution, the need for such specific architectural forms fell away. The demolition of the Palace of Machines and the dismantling of the mysterious tower in the backyard became the logical conclusion of the era of free energy. The destruction of these objects looks like covering tracks. After all, if the building had remained standing, engineers of future generations would inevitably have asked the question about the purpose of the strange metal rows on the roof and their connection with the detached tower. Demolition allowed the history of technology to be rewritten, leaving descendants only pretty pictures and stories about steam engines. The very concept that a building can be part of a machine was lost. Architecture ceased to be functional in an energy sense and became simply a shell for shelter from the weather. We lost the understanding of how the form of a structure can influence the environment and energy flows. However, the most intriguing discoveries await researchers not outside, where large-scale destruction hid the main evidence, but inside the pavilions. If one carefully studies the interiors of the exhibition halls captured in archival shots, one can notice a completely unimaginable juxtaposition. Among heavy presses, locomobiles, and lathes, in the very center of mechanical engineering expositions, objects were located that a modern person would identify as religious structures. A multitude of miniature copies of churches, temples, and chapels stood in the same row as industrial equipment, and this proximity was clearly not accidental. Moreover, if one looks closely at the device of these mock-ups, it becomes obvious that their internal filling had little in common with the performance of cult rituals. When immersing oneself in the atmosphere of industrial expositions of the late 19th century, the researcher encounters perhaps the most intriguing riddle of that era, capable of overturning all modern ideas about the purpose of traditional architecture. In huge pavilions dedicated to demonstrating the achievements of heavy machinery, amidst roaring steam hammers, lathes, massive flywheels, and weaving units, a completely unexpected class of exhibits is discovered. We are talking about numerous objects externally copying religious structures: miniature churches, chapels, temple complexes, and pagodas. Their presence in halls dedicated exclusively to technology and mechanics causes cognitive dissonance. Why display models of cult buildings in a temple of science and industry, where iron and steam rule? The answer lies in the detailed study of the internal structure of these objects. Upon closer inspection, it becomes obvious that before us are not architectural models intended to demonstrate the skill of architects. Inside the lattice structures, through arched openings and unglazed windows, complex mechanisms are clearly visible. Gears, coils, metal cores, and transmission shafts hidden behind the facades of holy abodes unequivocally indicate that the form of the building is merely a casing for a technical device. This discovery forces a rethinking of the very concept of a temple in the context of past technologies. If a machine stands inside a church, it means the church itself is an integral part of the engineering solution. Logic suggests that any machine implies the receipt and conversion of energy. In the age of steam, the dominant force was thermal energy obtained from burning coal. However, a steam engine is a bulky, dirty, and complex system requiring a boiler, a furnace, pipes, and smoke exhaust. The units disguised as cult structures have nothing in common with steam traction. They lack chimneys and furnaces. Their construction is elegant and light. Consequently, energy of a completely different order was converted here. The domed shape of the finial, the presence of spires and high vertical axes, once again confirm the hypothesis that in this case, natural electrical energy, extracted directly from the atmosphere, was used. In this context, elements that we are accustomed to perceiving as religious symbols acquire a purely utilitarian, technical meaning. The dome ceases to be simply a heavenly vault, turning into a resonator or accumulator of static charge. Spires and crosses, often having a complex fractal structure resembling spiral trees or multidimensional antennas, performed the function of receivers of etheric electricity. These spiral trees, abundantly decorating the tops of exhibition exhibits, were not decor, but a crucial functional node, without which the mechanism inside the building would remain dead weight. What is interpreted by art historians today as the canon of church architecture was, for the engineers of the past, a strict technical regulation for creating an energy reception circuit. Furthermore, obelisks crowned with glowing elements or strange spheres were frequently encountered at exhibitions. They were also part of the general chain, possibly fulfilling the role of transmission links or transformers. It is unclear whether such an obelisk was a leading or trailing link in the system, but its integration into the general row with generator churches is obvious. The quantity of such objects in old photographs is off the charts, creating the impression that before us is not an exhibition of scattered achievements, but a demonstration of a unified global energy system, the principles of which were understandable and accessible to the masters of that time. It turns out that just 100 years ago, humanity possessed the technology to obtain cheap, if not free, electricity, literally from the air. The atmosphere of that time possibly possessed different physical characteristics, or knowledge about methods of interacting with it was lost or intentionally removed from circulation. Temple machines demonstrated the possibility of autonomous energy supply without burning hydrocarbons. It was a clean, silent technology where the architectural form directly determined the efficiency of the device's operation. One might assume that such refinements were characteristic only of sophisticated Europe, and Paris, as the capital of fashion, was simply experimenting with the design of technical devices. However, the facts suggest otherwise. This technology was not a secret or a local French phenomenon. It was widespread everywhere, and the geography of its application stuns the imagination. Exactly the same principles, the same generator churches and atmospheric receivers were openly demonstrated and successfully functioned in places that today seem to us like the deep periphery. Skeptics might argue that the technological miracles described above were the exclusive prerogative of enlightened Europe, specifically Paris, which at that time was the undisputed center of global engineering fashion. However, the geography of the spread of atmospheric technologies turns out to be much wider, and traces of identical structures are found in territories considered, if not a technical periphery, then at least regions with a completely different way of life. If we transport ourselves thousands of kilometers to the east, to the Russian Empire, we see a picture that mirrors the Parisian reality, confirming the global nature of the lost knowledge. Even in remote corners of the empire, such as Blagoveshchensk, events were held demonstrating the same level of technical equipment. At the Amur Primoria exhibition of 1898, in a city that seemed like the end of the world to a capital resident of that time, pavilions were erected whose architecture raises a mass of questions today. Studying surviving evidence of this event, one can discover the very same mysterious spires, resembling miniature churches or chapels. However, their location and shape leave no doubt as to their utilitarian purpose. These were complex engineering structures, crowned with specific spiral-shaped elements resembling trees. These spirals, by all appearances, perform the role of receiving antennas or resonators. It is hard to imagine that in the harsh climate of the Far East, in conditions far from European comfort, engineers would spend resources on creating such complex decorations if they did not carry a functional load. A machine disguised as an architectural object implies the receipt of mechanical or electrical energy through the conversion of an external field. And if in Paris this could be written off as the whims of designers, then in Blagoveshchensk, where pragmatism came first, the presence of such devices suggests that obtaining energy from the atmosphere was a mundane, routine technology available even in the provinces. However, the true scale of Russian participation in this global energy network is revealed in Nizhny Novgorod. The famous Nizhny Novgorod Fair, in its respectability, scope, and technical level, was in no way inferior, and in some aspects even surpassed, the Paris Universal Expositions. It was a real city within a city, the commercial and industrial heart of the empire, where million-ruble deals were closed and advanced achievements were demonstrated. The architectural ensemble of the fair represented a highly complex system saturated with the same elements as the Palace of the Champ de Mars. The main pavilions of Nizhny Novgorod were dotted with rows of vertical pillars and spires. These elements, like their French counterparts, were not simply roof decorations. In these pillars lay the secret of autonomous lighting and power supply for the entire complex. There is a well-founded assumption that inside these structures were capsules with a certain substance or gas, which, under the influence of the atmospheric field, began to glow or initiated the ionization process necessary for the operation of gas discharge lamps. That is why the night illumination of the Nizhny Novgorod Fair amazed contemporaries with its magnificence and brightness, while not requiring the bulky infrastructure necessary for traditional incandescent lamps. Today, not a trace remains of this splendor. The fate of the Nizhny Novgorod Fair turned out to be just as sad as the fate of the Parisian palaces. On the site of the grandiose complex, which could have become a monument to world architecture and engineering, in the Kanavinsky district of the city of Nizhny Novgorod, there was simply a wasteland for a long time. Despite regular conversations in the mass media about reviving the fair, about returning its former status, reality looks depressing. Even if modern builders decide to recreate the external contours of the buildings, it will be merely an empty shell, a cargo cult. It is impossible to recreate the true essence of the fair because the technology is lost. No one will build functioning generator churches anymore. No one will install functional accumulator pillars on roofs because the very knowledge of their operating principles is under an unspoken but strictest ban. This decision was made not at the level of city architects, but at the global level of managing the development of civilization. What was destroyed in Nizhny Novgorod is not just brick walls. It is part of a unified world system of free energy that was dismantled everywhere. The wasteland on the site of the fair is a symbol of the void formed in our technical history, a gap in memory that modern surrogates fail to fill. Technologies that allowed obtaining cheap energy 100 years ago were forgotten not by accident, but were intentionally erased, leaving us with wires and meters. Where did all this heritage disappear to? Why did methods that were openly used before the eyes of millions suddenly become taboo? The answer to this question requires understanding what happened to the source of this energy itself, and why humanity was forcibly moved to different tracks of development. If we accept as an axiom that the architectural forms of the past, spires, domes, colonnades, and obelisks, were not merely decorative elements, but functional nodes of a global energy network, then the question inevitably arises about the nature of the force that powered this system. All facts indicate that 100 years ago, humanity knew how to interact with atmospheric electricity on a level that seems like fantasy today. This was not the burning of fuel to rotate turbines. It was a process of direct extraction of potential from the environment. We can assume that the planet's atmosphere itself at that time possessed different physical-chemical properties, was more saturated and conductive, which allowed energy to be obtained literally out of thin air, using resonant circuits, the role of which was played by temple complexes and exhibition pavilions. In this light, the figure of Nikola Tesla, whom official science is accustomed to viewing as a phenomenon of a brilliant loner ahead of his time, acquires a completely different meaning. It is quite likely that Tesla was not so much a discoverer of unknown horizons as the last keeper of a passing era, a man who was allowed to openly use ancient, previously generally known technologies during their twilight. His famous Wardenclyffe Tower strikingly resembles those very structures that stood en masse at industrial exhibitions in Paris, Chicago, and Nizhny Novgorod. Perhaps Tesla was trying to adapt old principles of etheric energetics to new conditions. Or maybe he was the only one allowed to demonstrate these capabilities while the global puppeteers decided the fate of the energy future of civilization. However, after Tesla's death, or rather at a certain historical moment in the early 20th century, a sharp paradigm shift occurred. Technologies that allowed obtaining energy without wires and meters were thoroughly purged. There is a hypothesis that this could be related to global changes in the Earth's atmosphere, some natural cataclysm that caused the etheric field to weaken and old resonators ceased to function. But the version of an artificial ban looks more plausible and cynical. Wireless energy is impossible to control. It cannot be sold by tariff. A meter cannot be installed on it. For emerging transnational corporations and financial elites, such technology represented an existential threat. That is why the bet was placed on hydrocarbons and wired current transmission. This created the consumer's dependence on the supplier, allowed building hierarchical systems of resource and capital management. Certain powerful forces decided to dismantle the old world not only physically by demolishing palaces and melting down equipment, but also mentally. A giant machine for rewriting history and physics was launched. Knowledge about obtaining cheap energy was declared heresy or pseudoscience, and equipment was destroyed or hidden in closed vaults. We, the descendants, were left only a truncated version of reality, where electricity is obtained by hard labor and costs money. If we delve even further into history, examining engravings and paintings from the 16th to 18th centuries, we can discover amazing evidence that electric illumination was not an invention of the late 19th century. The Kremlin, European castles, city streets in ancient images are literally flooded with light, the nature of which clearly has no relation to oil lamps or torches. This confirms that technologies of atmospheric electricity existed for centuries, being commonplace for our ancestors. Tesla merely tried to modernize what was the norm before the era of the Great Ban. In the early 20th century, an event occurred that divided technological history into before and after. The masters who possessed the secrets of building resonant generators were gone. Blueprints vanished, and physics textbooks were rewritten for new generations who were destined to live in a world of wires and sockets. A global mass deception occurred, calculated for 5 generations ahead, and today we live inside this artificially created matrix. The destruction of exhibition pavilions was an act of final cleanup of evidence. A global governing force placed a veto on free energy, directing civilization along the path of burning subsoil resources, which guaranteed control and profit. Proof of this forced change in the technological order lies on the surface. One only has to analyze how sharply the appearance of those same industrial exhibitions changed just a few years after the described events. The difference between expositions before 1917 and after 1920 is so striking that it is impossible not to notice. It was already a completely different world, devoid of the magic of the engineering genius of the past. To be finally convinced that the global change in the technological order was not natural evolution, but a forced demolition, it is sufficient to turn to documentary evidence dating to the period after 1920. The contrast between the eras before and after is striking and causes a sensation of deep, systemic degradation. If we look at archival materials of Parisian exhibition halls from 1923, a completely different world appears before us. The sensation of lightness and etheric saturation of space has disappeared. In place of the majestic temples of science and mysterious resonant structures came utilitarian, heavy everydayness, which became our reality for a century to come. The first thing that catches the eye when analyzing this new world is the change in the character of lighting. Instead of flooding shadowless radiance, the nature of which was hidden in architectural forms, we see dismal strings of incandescent electric bulbs suspended on crude wires. This web of wires became the symbol of the new era, the era of control and metering. Light ceased to be a property of space initiated by domes and spires. It became a commodity delivered in doses through a cable. Such lighting looks dim, dead, and artificial compared to the illumination captured in shots from the late 19th century. The architecture of pavilions also underwent cardinal changes, turning into a kind of cargo cult. Pillars and columns, which were previously functional elements of the energy system, remained in building designs but lost their essence. In buildings of the 1920s, they are present exclusively as a decorative element. Upon detailed examination, it is visible that bulbs with working substances are no longer attached to their bases, waveguides are not connected, and complex finials are absent. It is simply stone and plaster, mimicking the shape of ancient devices, but devoid of their content. Architects of the new time continued to copy external features, no longer understanding why these elements were needed initially, other than for beauty. The exhibition spaces themselves, once filled with living machines and miniature generator churches, emptied out. Those very mysterious units, inside of which fuel-free mechanisms were hidden, vanished without a trace. Their place was taken by the internal combustion engines familiar to us and primitive electric motors tied to a socket. Technological diversity was unified and reduced to a single standard, convenient for industrial production and monetization. The very atmosphere of mystery and infinite possibilities that reigned at the 1900 exhibitions was eroded. Pavilions that still remained in their places were living out their final days before final demolition. The cleanup process was total. All buildings forming the unified resonant network, from palaces in Paris to complexes in Nizhny Novgorod, were condemned to destruction. They were demolished with amazing haste, leaving no stone unturned, as if they feared someone might unravel the secret of their device. This was not urban reconstruction, but the erasure of memory. Not just walls were destroyed, but material proof of the existence of an alternative branch of civilization's development. We were left only a hollowed-out history, where progress moves linearly from the torch to the light bulb, and where there is no place for technologies capable of making humanity free from the resource needle. We live in a world built on the ruins of a more developed culture that we do not even remember. The old world was dismantled, its technologies declared impossible, and its achievements attributed to science fiction writers. However, despite all the efforts of the censors of the past, some artifacts still slip through the sieve of oblivion, stumping researchers. In concluding this investigation, I would like to draw attention to one unique document accidentally preserved in a mass of sorted archives. An old photograph from one of the exhibitions captures a unit, the design of which defies classification from the point of view of modern engineering. It is a complex device, devoid of the usual pistons, furnaces, or electrical windings, but clearly performing an important function. Its shape, combining crystal geometry and rotational mechanics, hints at operating principles that we have lost completely today. Looking at this object, one can only ask a question that perhaps no one is left to answer. Do you know what this is? Or have we sunk so deep into the illusion imposed on us that we have finally forgotten our real past, ceasing to recognize the tools our great-grandfathers possessed? This silent witness of a bygone era serves as a reminder of how much was lost and how little we know about the real history of technical progress.